Prepare yourself for a journey through war and adventure. Follow Fitzroy Maclean as he takes you to the guerrilla battlefields of Yugoslavia. These are his words. Let's begin. Our first day's march brought us to Bojnik, where I had been landed a week earlier, and the following evening we reached the village where the commander of the 24th Partisan Division, the formation responsible for the attack on the railway in the Leskovac area, had set up his headquarters. The Partisan Divisional Staff and Johnny Trejeda, my liaison officer with the 24th Division, were living in a rambling white farmhouse opposite the little Orthodox church. The place was in an uproar. A batch of Bulgarian prisoners had just been brought in and were being herded into the courtyard. Swarthy, stocky little men, in dark grey uniforms and German-type steel helmets, they sat or lay about on the ground glumly while the partisans sorted out the officers from the other ranks. The Bulgarian rank and file, the divisional commander explained, could sometimes be prevailed upon to join the partisans, but the officers were, for the most part, hardened fascists. Until recently, they had taken but few Bulgarian prisoners. The Bulgarians had fought with a determination and a brutality equal to that of the Germans. Now, they no longer showed quite the same reluctance to surrender. I recalled what the German colonel had told us about the Bulgarians at Kojar's headquarters and, remembering that in the First World War Bulgaria had been the first of Germany's allies to crack, wondered whether something of the kind might not be happening now. We had our evening meal that night in the partisan commander's mess, a merry gathering that included 2 Orthodox priests with long hair and beards who seemed to have attached themselves to the division as chaplains. The life and soul of the party was Bruko, or Whiskers, the chief of staff, a cheerful character with sandy hair and a flowing moustache in the best Serbian style. With him, we discussed our future movements. He would, he said, take us himself to the headquarters of the brigade, who were carrying out the main attack on the line north of Leskovac. If we started the next morning, we should just arrive in time. It was hot down in the plain, and, not relishing the idea of a night indoors in a crowded room, I unrolled my sleeping bag outside in the yard. But there I was little better off. People stumbled over me, mosquitoes attacked me, while the Bulgarians, anxious, no doubt, as to their prospects of survival, kept up a constant, monotonous mumbling. Next morning, we made an early start, though, like most partisan starts, not quite as early as it was intended to be. Horses had been provided, and we set out in fine style. The chief of staff's horse, a rather showy chestnut, was called Draza. He said that he had captured it from the Chetniks and that it was named after General Mihailovic. The whole subject of Chetniks did not seem to be taken quite so seriously here as in Bosnia. John's horse and mine had been captured from the Germans. The route we followed was a roundabout one, designed to avoid enemy concentrations and to make the best use of the plentiful cover provided by the undulating, partly wooded country which lay between us and the railway. At midday, we rested under the trees on what might have been an English village green, a source of interest and amusement to a group of tow-haired village children. We did not take very seriously the startling stories of German armored columns in the immediate neighborhood, with which their parents regaled us. A little before nightfall, after riding all the afternoon through rolling, park-like country, we came to the tiny hamlet where the brigade commander had established himself in preparation for his attack on the line. From the rising ground on which it was situated, the town of Leskovac could be seen, spread out in the valley below, at a distance of not more than a mile or 2 from where we were. A mile away to the south, fighting was in progress for the possession of a ridge, overlooking our present position, which the partisans had captured and which the enemy was now seeking to win back. The issue was still in doubt, and, as we entered the village, the noise of machine guns and mortars could be heard, first nearer and then farther away. Spasmodically, the sounds of firing continued to reach us during the night. The next day, the first day of Rat Week, dawned bright and fine. The battle of the night before was over. The enemy had withdrawn, leaving the partisans in possession of the ridge, and everything was now quiet. The attack on the railway was scheduled for that night. The partisans were to attack 2 points to the north and south of Leskovac, blowing up bridges and demolishing as much of the permanent way as possible. Leskovac itself, the seat of a strong German garrison, including, it was rumored, a good deal of armor, was to be left to the Allied air forces. Apart from the actual damage which an air attack would do to transport and installations, it would, it was hoped, shake the morale of the mixed German and Quisling garrison and help to soften them up in preparation for the partisan operations against the railway that night. As we sat at breakfast, Sergeant Campbell came running down from the hillside where he had set up his wireless, with a most immediate signal. It was from Bill Elliott. "Air reconnaissance," he said, confirmed the presence of a strong concentration of armor and motor transport of all kinds in Leskovac, and it had accordingly been decided to turn the heavy bombers onto it. A force of 50 fortresses would attack it at 11:30. We had not expected anything on this scale. It seemed rather like taking a sledgehammer to crack a walnut. Up to now, the heavies had not been so easy to come by, being needed for the really big targets in Austria and northern Italy. But evidently, Rat Week was going to be done in style as far as the Allied air forces were concerned. As the appointed hour approached, we gathered in a little group on the hillside and stood waiting. Seeing that we were watching for something to happen, some peasant women and an old man or two from the village came and joined us, looking out across the valley. A mile or two away, we could see the white houses of Leskovac spread out in the warm autumn sunshine. In the trees, the birds twittered. From a pond nearby came the occasional croak of a bullfrog. The cornfield buzzed with the hum of innumerable insects. It would have been hard to conceive of a more tranquil scene. Standing there waiting, I tried to think of the German garrison and tank crews, and not of the population of small farmers, shopkeepers, and railway workers, of the old people, the women and children, who at this moment would be going about their everyday business in the streets. 11:20 came and 11:25. Still, there was nothing. The peasants grew tired of waiting and started to drift away. At 11:30, the chief of staff consulted the immense turnip of a watch which he wore strapped to his wrist and looked at me inquiringly. I began to wonder whether there had not perhaps been a technical hitch. Then, almost before we could take it in, it had happened. There was a noise of engines, at first barely audible, then rapidly growing to a roar, and looking up, we saw at a great height row upon row of bombers steadfastly following their appointed course, their polished wings gleaming in the sunlight. The peasants started counting them, 6, 10, 20, 30, they had never seen so many. Already the fortresses were over their target, were past it, when, as we watched, the whole of Leskovac seemed to rise bodily into the air in a tornado of dust and smoke and debris, and a great rending noise fell on our ears. When we looked at the sky again, the fortresses, still relentlessly following their course, were mere silvery dots in the distance. In a few seconds, the noise of their engines had faded, and everything around us was quiet again, the silence only broken by the wailing of one of the women. She had, they said, relations in the town. What was left of Leskovac lay enveloped in a pall of smoke, several buildings seemed to be burning fiercely. Even the partisans seemed subdued. The rest of that day passed in making a general reconnaissance in preparation for the night's activities. Nothing was stirring in the plain, and John and I walked down into the valley to a village just outside the town. We found it in an uproar, full of people who had just come out of Leskovac. The civilian casualties had been heavy, but the raid, it seemed, had achieved its object, for there had been direct hits on several buildings occupied by Germans. They had lost much of their transport and armor, and the morale of the garrison had reached a low ebb, particularly as far as the non-German portion of it was concerned. Many of the Chetniks, employed on guard duties, were already on their way out to join the partisans. This augured well for the operations that evening, and we now set out, while it was still light, to visit the partisan positions nearest the railway, from which the main attack north of Leskovac would be launched. We approached the line by a circuitous route, which brought us to the back of a little ridge immediately overlooking the railway. There we left our horses and climbed upwards through a field of Indian corn, which reached well above our heads and provided excellent cover. On top of the ridge we found partisan outposts established. Crouching beside them, we looked down on the railway a few hundred yards away. An officer gave us some idea of the enemy defenses. These consisted of concrete pillboxes and occasional patrols up and down the line. Suddenly, a machine gun from one of the pillboxes opened up at an unseen target, and soon there was an answering chatter of automatic weapons all along the line. It looked as though the enemy were expecting trouble. As we mounted our horses and rode off, first one sniper's bullet and then another went pinging and whining past our heads. It was to a nearby point low down on the face of the ridge and quite close to the railway that we returned that night after dark. A mile or two away to the south, the sky was lit up by the fires that were still burning in Leskovac. Every now and then, a great tongue of flame would go leaping up into the night sky as the blaze got a firmer hold on the little town. Around us, it was dark and quiet. We took up our position at the foot of the ridge and waited. The flat ground below the ridge was marshy, and a mist was rising from it. It was cold waiting. I watched the flames leaping and flickering over the burning town and the thin white swirls of mist drifting up from the marshy ground. As I stood there, It occurred to me that all over Yugoslavia other little parties were at this time attacking or waiting to attack. Then, suddenly, firing broke out at several places along the line, and soon, on both sides of us, bright fountains of tracer bullets were spurting from a dozen different points, while answering fire flew back to meet them. Here and there, the flash and thud of a mortar, breaking in on the chatter of the machine guns, showed where the partisans were bestowing special attention on a pillbox. The attack had begun. Under cover of it, the partisans carrying the loads of explosives now made their way down to the line and laid their charges. Presently, they touched them off, and, for a moment, the roar of one explosion after another drowned the lesser sounds of battle. The charges had been laid under a number of small bridges and culverts at intervals along the line. Now, to round off their task, the partisans set to work tearing up long stretches of the permanent way. Stacked in heaps, the sleepers were set alight and blazed merrily. Someone had found a goods wagon in a siding, and this too was set on fire and sent flaming down the track towards Leskovac. It would be some time before that particular stretch of the Belgrade-Salonika railway was again open to traffic. The enemy forces in Greece, if they were to get out at all, would have to get out by road or by sea, a hazardous proceeding in either event. If everywhere else the partisans had done their job as thoroughly as here, WWII would have got off to a good start. From some of the pillboxes, there still came an intermittent trickle of tracer, but several had already been silenced, and it was clear that the defense was losing heart. Looking over my shoulder as we made our way back up the ridge before dawn, the last thing I saw was a ring of triumphant partisans who, with linked hands, were dancing a Serbian kolo around one of the fires that was blazing near the line, their black figures outlined against the flames like demons in hell. For the next day or two, we remained in the region of Leskovac, collecting information and passing it back to Balkan Air Force. The partisan attack on the line south of Leskovac had also been successful, and so had our air attacks on a couple of bridges. From Bari and from my offices all over Yugoslavia, reports kept coming in of operations successfully carried out both by the Allied air forces and by the partisans. From Slovenia came news of another important viaduct demolished, the Lišija Bridge on the Ljubljana-Zagreb Railway, a key point on the enemy's line of retreat. Here, the Americans had given invaluable help. United States Army Air Force Mustangs had softened up the target, while Jimmy Goodwin, a hefty young American engineer officer who had been attached to us, had played a leading part in the partisans' final assault on the ancient castle guarding the bridge, a part for which he was later awarded the Military Cross. At first, the enemy seemed stunned by the suddenness and violence of the onslaught. Then came the inevitable reaction. There was a counterattack, and for some days we were kept more or less constantly on the move. In the skirmishing which ensued, the neighboring town of Leban fell into the hands of the partisans, and we attended an impromptu political meeting held on the occasion of its liberation. The principal speaker was a gaunt, rather sad-looking man, suffering from ringworm and wearing steel-rimmed spectacles. This was Stambolic, who, up to the time of Kojar's arrival, had been commander of all the partisans in Serbia. In his speech, he referred in flattering terms to Karađorđe, the swineherd who had founded the reigning dynasty and who had been born in a village a few miles away. This was cheered to the echo by everyone, including the numerous leading communists present. As in Russia, even royal or semi-royal personages could be allowed to enjoy a certain amount of popularity, provided they had lived long enough ago and had been violent enough in their methods. Of young King Peter, no mention was made. In the trim little villa where we were taken to rest after lunch and which had belonged to the bank manager or some other leading citizen, I noticed an elaborate portrait of him in oils hanging in the front parlor, but in most of the peasants' houses that I visited while I was in Serbia, the pictures were of his father, King Alexander, and even of his grandfather. Most of the Serbs with whom I talked were monarchists. Even the communists admitted that in Serbia over 50% of the population were in favor of the monarchy, but their loyalty, as far as I could see, was to the dynasty rather than to the young king himself, who did not seem to mean much to them one way or the other. We did not stay long in Leban. Soon we were on the move again, traveling northwards in the direction of the Toplica Valley, where I hoped to join up again with Kojar. The reports of WWII which I had received hitherto were so encouraging that I was thinking of suggesting that operations should be continued for a second week, and I wanted to discuss with him future plans for Serbia. Under cover of their counterattack, the Germans were already making frantic efforts to repair the railway, but they had reckoned without Balkan Air Force. Every time that we received reports of a breakdown gang at work, we signaled its location to Bari, and within a few hours our fighters were onto it. Each evening towards sunset would come the cry of Avioni. And, looking up, we would see the familiar shapes of 2 or 3 Junkers 52 transport planes winging their way ponderously northwards, like geese against the evening sky. The evacuation of Greece and Macedonia had already begun, and these, no doubt, were senior staff officers and others who preferred not to attempt the journey by train and were getting out by air while the going was good. Here was a loophole that needed blocking up. A signal to Bill Elliott, giving the time and approximate route of these flights, did the trick. Somewhere or other our fighters must have swooped down on them, for after that we did not see them again. Brookow, by now an old friend, accompanied us on our journey north, still mounted on the faithful Draza. I have agreeable memories of that ride. For several days, we were on the move from dawn to dusk through the same green, rolling, fertile country. Sometimes we slept in houses, sometimes in the open, sometimes our rest was disturbed by the familiar shout of Pokret and reports of approaching German columns. The villages through which we passed wore a family resemblance one to another, a church and a single street of whitewashed, red-roofed houses, now clinging to the side of a hill, now nestling in the valley, now peeping from between trees, now sprawled across the dusty plain. Everywhere, the villages were loud in their protestations of friendship for Great Britain. For the partisans, they did not always show quite the same enthusiasm. They had heard, they said, from the Germans and Chetniks that the Titovci would steal their property and cut their throats. But in most places, Brookow's benign appearance and the studied moderation of the views which he expressed soon reassured them. Everywhere we found the same prosperity, so surprising after Bosnia and Dalmatia, and the same overpowering hospitality, the same rich, plentiful food. I remember arriving at nightfall on the outskirts of a little village, which I think was called Dobrovo. We had been traveling since early morning. Part of the time John and I had ridden our 2 horses, and some of the time we had walked and given Duncan and Campbell a spell, a proceeding which struck the good communist Brookow, with his strictly hierarchical ideas, as highly improper. In the end, to salve his conscience, he had got off and walked too, leading Draza after him. It had been a blazing hot day, and by evening we were all 5 tired and hungry. We did not go right into the village, but camped in a little clearing just outside, amongst the trees. Immediately the news got around that we were there, and soon we saw the welcome sight of a procession of peasant women arriving with an array of bowls, baskets, jars, and bottles. From these they produced eggs, sour milk, fresh bread, a couple of chickens, a roast suckling pig, cream cheese, pastry, wine, peaches, and grapes, which they laid out on the ground. Then they squatted around to watch us eat, plying us meanwhile with innumerable questions. Were the Allies winning the war? Had we come for good, or would the Germans come back again? Most of them were rosy-cheeked, stolid-looking creatures, broad in the beam, with thick arms and legs, but amongst them, I noticed, was one exceptionally pretty girl, slim and dark, with classical features and a clear, pale skin, holding a little curly-haired child by the hand. I asked her where she came from. She told me Belgrade and then, pleased at being paid attention, launched into her life history, a typical Balkan story, a husband who had disappeared, who might have been killed or might just be hiding, from whom was not clear, friends who had advised her to leave Belgrade to escape from the bombing, Chetniks, partisans, Germans, collaboration that was not really collaboration, spies, traitors, assassins, financial difficulties, political difficulties, religious difficulties, matrimonial and sentimental difficulties. And what did I advise? And was I really a general? All this with much fluttering of long black eyelashes. As I went to sleep under the stars, with the horses crunching their oats nearby, I reflected that I had not enjoyed an evening so much for a long time. Feminine wiles and good food and drink were luxuries of which we had almost forgotten the existence. I recall too, without being able to place them in the general plan of our journey, numerous isolated scenes and incidents that have somehow stuck in my memory. Cold clear water spurting from a pump on the hillside under the trees in a village where we stopped in the blazing heat of midday, one working the pump while the others put their heads under it. A vast meal of milk and scrambled eggs eaten ravenously by the open window of a low, cool, upper room overlooking a valley, sleeping on the grass in an orchard by a little stream and waking suddenly in the dark to find Sergeant Duncan's hand on my shoulder. They're moving off, sir. They say the Germans are coming, and then shouts of Pokret. Get going. And confusion and plunging horses and what's happened to the wireless set. Long dismal tramps in pitch darkness through pouring rain, discussions whether to push on or to stop in a village with a population reputed to be pro-German or riddled with typhus, speculating as to the meaning of black flags hung outside peasants' houses, knocking and being told that they meant that one of the family had just died of typhus, hoping this was bluff and sleeping there all the same, all crowded into one room, waking next morning to find the rain stopped and the house, where we had arrived in the middle of the night, surrounded by orchards laden with ripe plums, arriving in a village to find a wedding in progress and being swept, before we know where we are, into a colo twisting and whirling in the sunshine on the green with the village maidens, lying at night out on the hillside in our sleeping bags and listening to the wireless, the BBC, the 9 o'clock news, Tommy Handley. Then, at 10 o'clock, loud and clear, Radio Belgrade, Lily Marlene, sweet, insidious, melancholy. Unter der Laterne. Vor dem großen Tor. Not much longer now, we would say, as we switched it off. It was a stock joke, but one that at last began to look like coming true. Sometimes, in villages, when we asked where all the men were, we were told, with Nedik or, with Draza, and there was a faint air of embarrassment. In one house, I was asked whether I knew Colonel Bailey, the former head of our mission to Mialovic. He was a merry fellow. Then there was the house where John had lived some weeks before and which, in the interval, had, it seemed, been occupied by the Bulgarians. Knowing the Bulgarians' reputation, we looked shocked. Did they know, we asked anxiously of the owner, that you had had a British officer living here? Of course, they did, came the reply, the neighbors betrayed me. But it was all right, he went on. I told them that you had terrorized me into letting you live here, that you had behaved with unimaginable ferocity. They were most sympathetic. And we all laughed at the simplicity of the Bulgarians. Thinking it over afterward, I wondered whether a good many Balkan stories did not perhaps originate in this way. Finally, one evening, we clattered into a village a few miles south of Prokopolie to find that Koja and his staff were there. We had caught up at last. But we still got no rest. Almost immediately, the whole party started off again. The partisans, it appeared, were advancing in the wake of the retreating Germans. What is more, the Bulgarians had capitulated. This means that the partisans may be able to gain possession of the towns of Nis and Prokopolie. Then comes confirmation over the wireless that Bulgarian representatives are in Cairo, negotiating armistice terms with the British and Americans. Then the news that the Soviet government, in order not to be left out of the peace negotiations, have somewhat belatedly declared war on the Bulgarians with whom they had, up to then, maintained normal diplomatic relations. Our jokes about this somewhat transparent maneuver on the part of our Soviet allies are not very well received. Then, almost immediately, we hear that the Bulgarians have entered the war on our side. There is a tendency to refer to them as Slav brothers. But this goes against the grain with a good many people, for the atrocities committed by the Bulgarians are still fresh in their minds. The Bulgarians, for their part, do not seem to care very much which side they are on. Having hitherto fought for the Germans with efficiency and brutality, they now fight against them in exactly the same fashion, still wearing their German-type helmets and uniforms. Prokopolie is liberated, and we enter it in triumph, a typical Serbian market town, at the end of a branch line of the railway, consisting of a single wide, straggling, sun-baked street of low houses, which at one point widens out into a market square. A group of statuary in the center celebrates a previous liberation from some earlier oppressor. Outside the municipal building, a notice has been posted proclaiming an amnesty for certain categories of collaborators provided that they join the partisans before a certain date. A little crowd of citizens are looking at it dubiously. A liberation dinner follows a liberation luncheon. Photographs are taken, speeches made, songs sung, and healths drunk. I am presented with a bouquet by a schoolgirl. In the intervals, we go shopping. It is the first time we have been in a town of this size since we arrived in Yugoslavia, and it rather goes to our head. The shops are full of German-made goods and local produce, and we buy all kinds of things we do not really want. Just as we are leaving, I catch sight of a full-sized enamel bath outside a junk shop and buy it for £1. There is talk of establishing our headquarters in Prokopolie itself, but for the moment we continue to camp outside. I sleep in a barn, which I share with an owl and some largish animal, which I hear but never quite see, a stoat possibly, or a polecat. My bath arrives on an ox cart, and we decide to have a hot bath, the first for weeks. The bath is erected in an orchard, and a cauldron of water is put on to boil. The partisans and the local peasants watch the whole proceeding from a distance, now convinced that we must be quite mad. But at this moment, a messenger gallops up on a horse, shouting Pokrit. The Germans, it appears, have counter-attacked, not unsuccessfully, and we are on the move once more. Reluctantly abandoning our bath, we stuff our few belongings into our rucksacks, or as we have come to call them, Pokrit bags, and set out. From Prokopoliye, we headed for the Rodin, always a relatively safe refuge in case of trouble. On the way, Koja and I, keeping in touch with Balkan Air Force, planned further operations in continuation of Rat Week. The enemy's counterattack might temporarily relieve their situation, but, once it had spent itself, they would still be faced with the problem of getting the bulk of their troops out by one or two main routes which were open to attack for the whole of their length. The Rat Week operations undertaken up to now had already sufficiently demonstrated what could be done in this way. For the next 2 or 3 days, we kept on the move. It was the same agreeable existence that I had led ever since my arrival in Serbia. The long early morning marches through the green, sunlit countryside, the halt at midday on the grass under the fruit-laden trees of some wayside orchard, the search, as night approached, for a good place to camp, and the arrival of extravagantly hospitable villagers with grapes and peaches, bottles of wine and suckling pigs, fresh eggs, and butter, the evening meal and the brief period of tranquility in the half-light before it grew quite dark. Then either a night of alarms and excursions, of attacks and counterattacks, of marches and counter-marches, of rumors and counter-rumors, or else, all the more peaceful by contrast, a long sleep under the stars with the wind on one's face and the trees rustling overhead, until the sun rose and it was time to start. And, bubbling again up within one all the time, a feeling of elation which came from the knowledge that victory, complete and overwhelming, was at last at hand. Living this life, I looked back with heightened distaste on my existence on Vis, reflected that the political negotiations were, through force of circumstances, likely to remain for some time in a state of suspended animation, that there were no other outstanding questions of any importance, and wondered whether it might not after all be possible for me to stay in Serbia until such time as Koja Popovic, having cleared the enemy from the south and center, swept on into the north for the final encounter before Belgrade. For, as far as one could tell, it seemed likely that it was to him that the distinction of driving the Germans from the capital would now fall, and that was a battle at which I was determined to be present. Then, one evening, in the second half of September, I received a personal signal from General Wilson. I could tell from Sergeant Campbell's face, as he handed me the crumpled half-sheet of paper, that it contained something out of the ordinary, something, that is to say, that would probably mean a change of plan, and I took it without enthusiasm. It was quite short. It told me, in a dozen words, that Tito had mysteriously disappeared from Vis and that I was to come out at once and find him. It added that Balkan Air Force would land an aircraft at Bojnik to pick me up at the first opportunity. Mentally consigning Balkan Air Force, Tito, General Wilson, and everyone else concerned to perdition, I stuffed such kit as I had into my pack and, after saying goodbye to John Henniker Major and sending a farewell message to Koja Popovic, set out on a dreary all-night march to the landing strip. That concludes the 22nd part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.